This week we are talking about Chapter 7, which is measuring and monitoring program outcomes. So when we talk about outcomes, this should be fairly familiar to you based on the indicators assignment. So when we're talking about outcomes, we're talking about whether or not questions dealing with whether or not a program is working. In other words, is a program achieving the desired social change or the change in the target population that it sought to achieve through its activities. Outcomes need to be measurable. So if you have an outcome of, I can't think of an example, but anything where you can't actually measure it, then it's not an outcome in terms of evaluation. So it needs to be measurable, and it typically involves, outcomes typically involve observing social conditions or the target population. So these are not related to the program itself. So if you have something like the program is designed to provide 25 free personal training sessions in a 1 or 3 month time period, that is an output. So an output, or those are things that the program is designed to do in terms of its activities. That is not an outcome. An outcome might be changes in confidence. So that would be a change you could observe in a target population, or it might be weight loss. Again, that would be an outcome that you would observe in a target population. It might be making healthier decisions when it comes to exercising and eating. Again, that is an outcome. But saying, did the program actually deliver 25 personal training sessions in a 1 month or a 3 month time period? That is an output. So an outcome is related to a social condition or the target population, where the output is related to the program's delivery of the services. Evaluators need to consider not only the extent to which outcomes exist, but whether they are in the expected direction. So if you say, I expect the delivery of these personal training sessions to lead to improvements in self-confidence, then if you saw a change in self-confidence, you would expect it to be a positive change, not that people feel worse about themselves after going to personal training sessions. So evaluators need to look at whether the outcomes, not only the extent to which they're occurring, but also are they occurring in the expected direction, and this is a little bit more difficult to assess, whether they are actually caused by the program itself. So if participants are reporting improvements in self-esteem or weight loss, is it because of the personal training sessions, or is it something else? So for example, if the personal training session started right after the new year, there could have been other New Year's resolutions, maybe not the personal training sessions, that led to the weight loss or the improvements in self-esteem. You know, maybe a New Year's resolution is to read something positive every day, and it was that. Or if it was to go for a walk or spend more time with your family, or other things that could be associated with that outcome. So the outcome is occurring, but it's not because of the program itself, or it's only in part because of the program itself. And that is a little bit more difficult of a question for an evaluator to assess. And we'll talk a little bit more about this later, but the longer term the outcome is, the more difficult it is to determine how much of those effects are attributable to the program itself versus other factors. Some terminology, outcome levels, and your book talks about these, so this is just to review and reinforce. Outcome level is the status of an outcome at any given point in time. So if you're providing personal training sessions and you're taking weights, individuals' body weights throughout that, or if you are giving a survey assessing people's self-esteem at any point in time, whatever it is that you're measuring. So someone's weight after 4 sessions, that is an outcome level. An outcome change is the difference in an outcome level. So an outcome change might be how much did someone's weight change, either go up or down, between the beginning of the program and session 4 versus session 8 versus at the end of the program. So if you're looking at change, that's an outcome change. The program effect is the portion of the outcome change that is attributable to the program. So if somebody lost, let's say, 20 pounds, between the beginning of the program and the end of the program. How much of that was because of the personal training sessions? Did the people also have changes in their eating habits? Did they have other changes in their exercise habits? So not just going to the personal training sessions, but maybe they started walking or hiking or running or bicycling or rock climbing. Maybe they were making other changes in their lifestyle, eating with respect to eating and exercise, that also would have caused them to drop weight. So it's not to say that the personal training sessions didn't have that outcome, but the weight loss, assuming it occurred, isn't 100% because of the program. So the program effect is what percentage or what portion of the outcome change occurred because of the program. The outcome variable is the measurable characteristic or condition of the target population that is attributed to the program. To effectively measure change, so when we're talking about change resulting from the program, it's better to have an outcome level measure from before the program starts. So if you're going to say participants lost weight because of these personal training sessions, you would need to know what their weight was at the start of the program, or at least it would be ideal to have that, to be able to say that, yes, they lost weight and this is how much weight they lost. Now, if you didn't have that data, it's not to say you couldn't make an assessment. Like, you could still say, you could do self-report. Participants might even say, look, I didn't know my weight when I started the program, but I know I lost weight. I've dropped how many clothing sizes, or I can just tell, by looking at my body, I can tell that it's changed. So it's not to say it would be impossible to determine change without a pre-measure, but it's ideal to have a pre-measure. Then you can say, yeah, participants on average lost 20 pounds, and the range was anywhere from, the fewest was someone lost 10 pounds, but the most, somebody lost 38 pounds. And so to have that, that level of detail, you would need a pre-measure. In other words, an outcome level at the time the program started. The first step in developing measures of program outcomes is to identify what the relevant outcomes are. So, for Children's Outreach Project, by having a preschool that has all of these specific programs in it, what outcomes are they hoping to accomplish? At the end of a speech therapy session, is there a goal at the end of a single session? Is it, over the course of a few months, we expect to start seeing some gradual changes? Is it, we expect to see pretty abrupt changes, but it might take 4 months to start seeing those changes? So, and that, is determined oftentimes in conjunction with stakeholders in the program. So an evaluator wouldn't necessarily be able to go in and say, I expect to see these changes as a result of speech therapy. Somebody might need to tell the evaluator that. So when you're measuring outcomes and identifying what is a relevant outcome, so, in a personal training session, what is the goal? If you provided 25 sessions over the course of 1 or 2 months or something, what would you expect some outcomes to be? And an evaluator might have a say in that, but primarily that's going to be talking to stakeholders about what they think the program should accomplish. And oftentimes, too, you would just start with what are the missions? What are the actual stated missions or goals or objectives of a program? You might have people who are funding the program saying, look, we're going to provide support, but we expect to see these changes occur in social conditions or in the target population. So that's another source of identifying outcomes. It could be the funder saying, this, if we're funding your program, this is the change that we expect to see. You also could look at the program impact theory to see what outcomes you expect to occur. And that's where, remember the logic model, where based on a theory, you would say, okay, we expect these program activities to be associated with these immediate outcomes and then these longer term outcomes. And so right there, you have different outcomes, short and possibly long term. So logic models would depict both of those. And your book talks about long-term outcomes and refers to those as distal outcomes. Arguably, the longer-term outcomes are more important, but they're also more prone to external influences beyond the program. So there is that challenge. So if you think about Children's Outreach Project, to say, okay, we expect some long-term benefits of these programs to be school readiness. So if these kids are in preschool there for 1 or 2 years, we expect that by the time they get to kindergarten, that they're better off than they would have been without those programs. Or, children who are in similar situations or have similar disabilities or situations who don't receive those therapy services. So we would expect school readiness to improve. But the problem is that you could say, okay, over the course of 1 to 2 years, their school readiness is going to improve anyway, just as a result of natural maturity. And when we talk about experimental designs, that's actually called a maturation threat or a maturation effect. And it's a threat to validity, because we might say, wow, look how great our program is. These kids are ready to go. Like, they've improved leaps and bounds over the course of 2 years. But the mistake in that logic could be those improvements would have occurred anyway, because the kids naturally mature into school readiness. And it's the same thing with adolescence and crime. There tends to be an age crime curve. So there's a certain age group that is more prone to commit delinquent offenses. And most people age out of that naturally. So we might, especially if kids end up in the juvenile system or diverted maybe out of the formal system, but still in different programs through the diversion, if that happens, we might be likely to say, wow, look how successful these programs are, when in fact the kids would have aged out of it anyway. And that's called a maturation effect. And so as you measure longer term outcomes, that is more likely to be a threat. We also have a different, in the experimental design literature, a threat that's called history. So if you're looking at the effect of like a juvenile transfer law, saying, okay, we're going to start transferring more juveniles to adult court, and basically scare kids into not committing serious crimes. And then and the research that has been done actually has shown that it doesn't work, that juvenile violent crime does not decrease with the threat of adult transfer or transfer to adult court. But hypothetically, let's say that there was an effect that we saw over time, that juvenile delinquency diminished, that violent crime decreased. And we said, wow, it looks like these laws work. We need to start transferring more juveniles to adult court. The longer term outcome would also suggest what else was going on other than the passage of that transfer law in that period of time that would have affected juvenile delinquency. So there could be demographic changes. If the transfer laws were part of a larger movement to deal with juvenile crime and delinquency, then it could be that these other things were making a difference and that it wasn't the law. So that's called a history effect, when there are other things going on beyond the program and its activities that could have affected the outcome. So again, going back to how to determine what outcomes to measure, stakeholder perceptions, goals, missions, and objectives that are stated by the program impact theory, which is depicted in a logic model. You can look at prior research, looking at evaluation research on similar programs, look at similar measures of different outcomes. Also, evaluators need to pay attention to unintended outcomes that could occur. Evaluators should try to identify what those unintended outcomes are. Can look at previous research. Theory can talk about, like, if these outcomes occur, these other things occur with those outcomes. And then researchers also can look at firsthand accounts of people who are actually observing the effects. So if you're looking at, someone observing an intensive therapy program, and they might say that, the kids seem to benefit from this, but, it's having the unintended effect of making them really, really tired by the end of the day. So they tend to not do well in any activity that occurs right after that. Or they might say it's having the unintended effect, having these really intensive therapy programs where the therapists are working with these kids pretty nonstop in an intensive environment. It is having an unintended effect of burnout on the therapist. So you might look at outcomes like that you're not necessarily going to measure them as positive intended outcomes of a program, but you as a researcher would need to document that and talk about, these unintended effects are also occurring and how those should be managed. Measuring program outcomes. If there are a whole bunch of outcomes, it might not be feasible to measure all of them. In fact, a lot of times it's not. So the evaluator, in conjunction with the stakeholders, would need to choose the most important ones and also the most feasible ones. So some of the really long-term outcomes might not be feasible depending on access to data. To measure outcomes, you have to have observable indicators that vary with changes in circumstances. So if you are looking at a program that is designed for delinquent boys, you can't look at the effect of gender because there's no variation. It's all boys. So you can't say, well, does this program help boys and not girls, or girls and not boys, or does it have a better effect on one gender than another? That outcome is not feasible because you're looking at the program's application to boys only. So that's what it means, the book means, when it's talking about you need indicators that are observable. So gender is observable. You can look and say, this person is a boy versus a girl. But it's not, there's no variation. So if you cannot observe it or measure it, it's out. You wouldn't evaluate it. And if it doesn't vary, you wouldn't measure it. You couldn't, because there's no way to look at change between groups or change in a variable if it doesn't change or vary. Some indicators are very easy to measure and very easy to observe. So the weight loss example, to say, okay, what's your weight at the start, outcome level at the start of the program? What's your weight after 2 weeks, after 4 weeks, after 6 weeks, after 8 weeks? That's pretty straightforward, assuming the measure is on the same or a similar scale and done in a similar way. Like, you wouldn't want to weigh somebody without clothes on the first time and then they come in 10 layers and heavy hiking shoes or boots because it's wintertime, and then you weigh them with all those clothes on. So assuming, similar circumstances, then that's a really easy thing to measure, where other indicators are not very easy to measure. Some outcomes have multiple dimensions. So for example, if you're measuring wellness or happiness, those things have a lot of different dimensions. So if you're talking about wellness, you might say, okay, what are different dimensions of that? It might be blood pressure, it might be weight, it might be the absence of certain diseases. So the outcomes that have multiple dimensions, you might not be able to include every dimension, but you would want to include as many as possible. So you wouldn't want to just say, is it the presence or absence of diabetes? That's your measuring wellness. You would want to try to include as many indicators as possible. If you try to rely on one indicator, it's probably not going to be a valid representation of that entire outcome. And that issue in the methodological literature is called construct validity. So what that means is that you have an entire construct like wellness or happiness or depression, and if you're not measuring every dimension of that construct, or at least most of them, then you have an issue with construct validity because you're not representing the construct as a whole. When the book talks about measurement procedures and properties, it goes through possible data sources, and hopefully this should be fairly straightforward to you. So just think of places where you might obtain data. So for us, we're going to look at records. I don't think we're going to be able to observe, but that would be a potential source of data if we could actually go in and observe therapy sessions or instruction through the Incredible Years curriculum. So we're not going to be able to do that, at least I don't think so, but that would be a potential source of data. Interviews, surveys. So it's pretty straightforward. How would you obtain information on different outcomes? You would convert information to data through a process called operationalization. So if we're looking at a file of information that includes disciplinary reports, so that's a set of information. You have information in those reports. You would operationalize that or convert it into data by maybe, let's say, if you wanted to say how many disciplinary infractions per week does a kid have. So you would have week 1, week 2, week 3, and then each week a count of how many disciplinary reports. reports. That might be one way to convert it into data. Another way might be to say, for every infraction that a kid has, did it involve violence? Or was it, something like talking back or stealing something from another, or taking something from another kid? But if it involved violence, hitting or pinching or biting or whatever, then maybe that gets a 1 versus if it doesn't. So if it's, a kid taking something from another kid or a kid talking back, then it gets a 0 because it was not a quote violent infraction. So you might convert that information in the file into data. In other words, you're operationalizing whether or not an infraction involved, violence sounds harsh, but for lack of a better word, violence, or interpersonal contact, inappropriate contact, or something like that. So you would say, if the answer is yes, we write a 1, and if the answer is no, we write a 0. That's how we convert or operationalize that into data. To figure out, okay, we want to look at how in the past have behavioral measures or behavioral indicators been measured. So you might look at previous literature to say, okay, existing measures look at how many. Existing measures look at whether or not they involved inappropriate contact or violence, so to speak. So you could look at, and that's what I was having you guys do with the indicators. What does previous research show in terms of how different indicators or outcomes should be measured? Reliability is the extent to which a measure produces the same results when it's used repeatedly to measure the same thing. For example, a scale. A scale should be reliable. So if you get on the scale, there should be minimal fluctuation. So if you get on a scale right now 15 times, you should if it's a digital scale that goes to the 10th of a pound, you should be within 1 to 2 tenths of a pound every single time you step on that scale. So that means it is a reliable indicator of weight. Now, that's not to say it's valid, and I'll talk about that in a minute, but what it means is every time you get on it, it's going to give you a consistent measure. Now, if you get on it and it tells you 150 pounds, even, and then you get on it and it's 150.1, and then it's 149.9, and then it's 150. So far, it's reliable. But then you get on it, and maybe, let's say the battery's dying, and it's all of a sudden it puts you at 12 pounds. And then you get on it again, and it puts you at 300 pounds and tells you there's an error. That's not reliable anymore because it's giving you very different measures every time you step on it. So if you have something that's more objective or digital or formal, like a scale, those tend to be more reliable than the subjective measures that rely on participant responses. So you're looking where possible for more standardized objective measures. Now, oftentimes that's not possible, and that's fine too, but you just have to recognize that the reliability is going to be more of an issue for the more subjective participant-oriented responses. Validity is the extent to which something measures what it's supposed to. So if you step on a scale, is it actually measuring your weight? Now, if a scale, let's say it's calibrated wrong. So let's say it's weighing you 10% or 10 pounds too heavy. So you're getting on it, and every time you get on it, it tells you you're 150 pounds. So it is reliable. It's the same. It's consistent. So reliable, repeat. Think of it like that. Reliable, repeat. Every time you get on it, it's consistent. It's repeated. So it can be reliable. Every time you get on it, it tells you you are 150 pounds. But every time you get on it, it's weighing you 10 pounds too heavy. So it's not valid. It's not actually measuring your weight. Your true weight is 100, let's say 140. And if that's the case, it's reliable, but it's not valid. Now, if a measure is valid, it has to be reliable, because if it's valid and it's measuring what it's supposed to, then it will measure what it's supposed to every time. So you can have a measure that is reliable but not valid, but if a measure is valid, it has to be reliable. And if you have questions about that, let me know, but I hope that the scale example makes sense to you. So you can get on a scale and it can be wrong repeatedly. Think about if you put a scale on a carpet. It will give you the same measure over and over and over again, but it's wrong. But if it is accurate, then it will be accurate every time if it's actually measuring your weight. Um, Measuring validity, like trying to assess the extent to which a measure is valid, that's pretty subjective. So if you guys say, we think that a valid measure of the Incredible Years curriculum will be this, there's some guidance on that, but it's not like there's some statistical test where you can say, yep, it's valid, or no, it's not. So you just kind of rely on previous research, expert opinions. If a measure has been validated in the past, use stakeholder perspectives. But it's pretty difficult to truly assess validity. Another thing you can do is see if a measure correlates in the expected direction with something that it should be correlated with. So if you're like, well, I want to see if self-reports of very liberal to very conservative, I want to see if that's truly a measure. Is that a valid indicator of political affiliation? Is a self-report very conservative to very liberal? Then what you might do is also ask questions on attitudes toward gun control or abortion or capital punishment, and then say, okay, I would expect people with very liberal attitudes to have these attitudes on those issues, and people who are very conservative should have these attitudes on these issues. Now let's correlate them and see if that's actually the case. And if you find that that's actually the case, then it's an indicator that yes, your question is a valid measure of political affiliation. Now, if you're like, well, no, I didn't find that, then maybe you weren't actually measuring political affiliation, because you would expect political affiliation to be correlated with social and political attitudes. Sensitivity of the measuring instrument. So we're talking, the book gives a really good example of scales. So you can get on a scale in a truck stop, and that's not going to be super sensitive to your weight because it's not meant to weigh people. But if you get on a digital scale that measures down to the 1/10 of a pound or down to the ounce, then that's going to be a pretty sensitive measure. Just the way you step on the scale might alter the exact number it produces. Or if you put on a sweater, it's going to change what the scale says. Or if you take something off, it's going to change what the scale says. So that scale, one that is digital and goes to the 1/10 of a pound or down to the ounce or something, that's going to be a very sensitive measure. In program evaluation, we need to be careful that a measure doesn't relate to something other than what the program is expected to change. Your book gives an example, and I also was thinking, from an instructor perspective, if I gave a pre-test of knowledge on the criminal justice system before I started an intro-level class, and I said, okay, I just want to see how much you guys know about the justice system, gave a pre-test, then taught the class, and then at the end of the class, gave another test, a post-test. And let's say that my pre-test and my post-test cover a whole bunch of stuff that I never actually review in class, then my test might be skewed because people wouldn't have learned some of the material. So it might show that there wasn't that much of a change, but I included a bunch of stuff on the test that I never covered in the class. So there shouldn't be a change. The book also talks about being cautious about using standardized diagnostic measures, and the book explains why. But basically, there tends to be a really wide variation in those tests. So if you're observing wide variation, both pre and post test, then it can be difficult to detect individual differences. And then the final words for the chapter, the book talked about outcome monitoring, and this is just collecting data on indicators on a routine basis. This can be, if you have the ability to do it, it can be a useful approach to impact evaluation. It's pretty inexpensive, and it can provide information in a reasonable time frame, basically as you're going along. So if you're doing a full impact evaluation that includes the longer term outcomes, that can take years to complete. But if you're doing outcome monitoring and you're getting information on indicators as you go, you can have data basically at your fingertips, and you don't have to really wait. Outcome monitoring also is a technique that can be used to provide feedback to program managers and other stakeholders. So as you're measuring different outcomes, you can say, wow, like this program is working even better than we thought, right off the bat. Or you can say, we expected to start observing changes by now, we're however many weeks or months in, and we're just not observing changes. What's going on? You know, can we make adaptations to the program? Is it an implementation issue? Is it a program theory issue? Is it a measurement issue? Are we not measuring outcomes the right way? So it can be a really great way to generate feedback and make changes as you go along. And your book talks about some of, they call them the pitfalls of outcome monitoring. So make sure you're familiar with those also. If you have any questions about anything, let me know. I think that about covers what we need to know for measuring and monitoring program outcomes. And you guys will get to see this applied when we, which is essentially now, start drafting the method sections and gathering data for children's outreach projects. So right now we're really setting ourselves up for the meat of this project, which is pretty exciting. So if you have questions, let me know. And I think, like I said, that, you know, being able to apply this stuff hands-on is going to really be a way for you guys to see how this material is applied to an actual evaluation.